Thank you for joining Resilient Cyber Show. My name is Chris Hughes, and today I'm joined by Kevin Greene. Kevin, thanks for being here, man.
Hey, Chris, it's been a minute, man. It's my pleasure. Thanks for the invite. Looking forward to this conversation today. Thank you very much.
Yeah, likewise. I'm excited to chat. We've crossed paths many times on LinkedIn and comments and posts and stuff like that, but never have chatted live. So this will be interesting. And, I want to learn a little bit about your background before we dive into some questions. You've had some interesting roles from FFRDCs to like private sector organizations. So tell us a little about your journey.
So at the heart, I'm a Jersey guy, right? So after undergrad in New Jersey Institute of Technology, my alma mater, I moved down and to Maryland about, I'm not going to say what year, that's going to give away my age. But I kind of started my roots at Verizon, Bell Atlantic at the time, right? Which just before the name switch. I was there during the time the name switch. They were talking about the name switch. And I got interested in at the time Bastion Firewall, Solaris Sandbox. I was working at Network Operations Center, so I would do my normal shift, 8 hours, then come in at night, change controls, sit with the guys. A guy by the name of Joe Morris, who was really, really good at implementing the Solaris Bastion Firewall. So that's kind of how I got my fundamental passion for cyber. And obviously, looking at the future, everything was becoming more internet enabled. So I was like, hey, this is probably the route to go. So I have about close to 30 years of experience in cyber. And from there, around the .com boom, right? Everything was going from brick and mortar to online. That was a huge area. So then I worked at a number of spots doing SecOps, firewall deployments. We did a lot of work I worked for a company that did a lot of managed firewall stuff for PSINet at the time, right? Out in Herndon, Virginia. So I spent a lot of days and nights in the Herndon data center, PSINet, supporting that. Then eventually I got into some of the more things that kind of more suited to what I'm doing now. I was at E&Y for an extent, doing pen testing, ethical hacking. And at the time, most folks don't know this, but at the time, that's when George Kurtz, Stuart McClure, all the guys from Foundstone, we were all at E&Y at the same time. And I was in the McLean office supporting and doing ethical hacking. So we would support clients and stuff like that. And then eventually I got out of that business and started doing things around supporting federal government contracts. So I was a contractor around the Beltway Bandit for a while, right? Running security programs and doing certification accreditation, doing IV and V testing. Then eventually I got a call from Doug Mon at the time, because I was at S&T doing some contracting work at one point, supporting all the IV and V and some of the CNA stuff from a technical perspective. And at that time, I really kind of like evolved the testing practice to kind of incorporate application security tests, because at that time, no one was really doing application security testing. So I was like, we need a way to cover the application perspective. So and then eventually I recircled back with Doug years later, and he's like, hey, Kevin, you want to come over to be a Fed? And I came over and I had the privilege of serving this nation, and I served at DHS S&T, Science and Technology Director in the Cybersecurity Division for about a good 6 years, where I was a program manager. I was responsible for all of the R&D around software security. So I did some really, really cool things that I'm very proud of, and most people don't know. One of my first research projects that I made public was it was a SBIR, Small Business Innovation Research Grant. It was called Hybrid Analysis Mapping. I called it HAM, right? Everything in the government has an acronym, right? I called it HAM. That work was basically looking at a way to improve or reduce false positives, but also figure out a way to get deeper testing around application security testing. So I was able to have a research that took static and dynamic analysis and normalized and correlated to kind of figure out how do we get better fidelity and results, because as you know, a lot of these tools, they produce a lot of false positives. So I had two performers. At the time, Denham Group was one, and also Secure Decisions, right? And one of the things I'm most proud of is that my research through hybrid analysis mapping was initially commercialized through CodeDX, which was acquired by Synopsys later on was acquired by Synopsys, and ThreatFix was later acquired by Codefire. So I'm proud of developing research that can make it back out into the practice, right? And having research that I did be commercialized and later acquired, right? That's kind of one of the things I kind of pride myself on, really having that under my belt. And then I left there and went to MITRE. MITRE was a very interesting experience. It's a little stuffy for me, coming from running my own program, about a $15 million budget a year, funding software assurance and software security stuff. So I worked on some really, really cool things at MITRE, I will say. Supported some DevSecOps Tiger teams, supported DevSecOps for NATO. One of the most things I'm really proud of is having an opportunity to work on the MITRE attack team, where I gained a wealth of knowledge. This is right before Blake left and Katie left, Katie Nichols and Blake Strong, but right before they left. So I was able to kind of pick their brains a little bit. Later went and worked for Parasoft for about a year as director of security solutions, and then eventually made my way over to Micro Focus, which was acquired earlier this year by OpenText. So I'm very excited about my journey, right? I've learned and met some really, really wonderful people along the way. Have a wealth of experience, and I try to share my experience and things I've learned. Being an African-American male, it's not always easy. I always have to work, a little bit harder to kind of, earn my respect in the industry. But, all in all, I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say, you've walked the walk. Like, you've got a pretty deep experience in a lot of different domains. You talked about starting on like on-premise firewalls, managed services, running the gamut of being a federal employee, working at FFRDC, moving to application security testing and hybrid analysis, like you talked about. I want to ask, like, before we dive into the next question, like, you've seen a lot in cybersecurity. You've seen the evolution from on-prem to cloud to AppSec. What are some things that you think have changed the most? And then, what are some things that haven't quite changed and the kind of things that have stayed the same despite all the evolution of technology and the way we do things? Some things just never change. Like, what are your thoughts there?
I'm not sure things have really changed. I do think what we see is a widening attack surface because software is ubiquitous, right? Software is everywhere. And because of that, I think we're seeing the result of that. More code means more problems, and more problems typically result in vulnerabilities, right? So I think that's probably one of the biggest things I think have changed in a large attack surface, because software has become so ubiquitous and software is everywhere. And we as a nation haven't done a really, really good job at developing and securing software. So I think that's probably one of the most fundamental things that have changed, right? Then you take software, you take hardware, you take infrastructure. Now you're pulling all this stuff together. And I think, that convergence point become a very, very interesting and somewhat introduces complexity in terms of how we protect our systems. So I do think they introduce a lot of vulnerabilities that we are seeing now, right, with design and software CVEs and CWEs, which we really got to get a better grasp on, because I think at the end of the day, it's an attack vector that adversaries are constantly after, right? They are doing a lot of different things to be very resilient in terms of how they attack our software, right? So software, to me, or securing software, is our first line of defense, not a firewall, not IDS, not any widget you put on the network. But I think software security becomes our first line of defense, and we need to make sure we maintain that security posture and the mentality in how we defend this nation.
Yeah, it's well said. And like I've been saying, like you talked about, software is pervasive from everything from our, kind of consumer goods to critical infrastructure, national security, weapon systems. It's pervasive across every aspect of society. So it's a lot of things to try to protect now. And the more pervasive it is, the more vulnerabilities, the more attack surface, the more exploitability opportunities, things like that you touched on. We are seeing a push now. This is not a new concept, right? Like, I'm sure you've heard this throughout your career, but now secure by design. We're seeing this big push for secure by design. I know you're passionate about like the topics of secure software development life cycles that we hear talk of, and you've raised some good points on this topic. So what do you think about this big push for secure by design, secure SDLC? What are your thoughts on that front?
I want to commend CISO for really taking a mantle and getting behind this, right? This secure by design, because I think it's it's needed, right? I think one of the fundamental things we see change from a software development standpoint is I don't think we're at a point where we're actually developing a lot of code, doing a lot of coding, developing a lot of software. I call it software construction, right? We're taking pieces of different open source or COTS, whatever, and we're trying to build and design a system. So design becomes very important, right? Design becomes very important. How we reduce complexities and technical debt, how we reduce, potential interfaces that can be exposed, right? We start talking about cyber resiliency, right? Minimization is probably one of the biggest things that I think we don't do a good job at. But I like the approach with secure by design, given the fact where we are in terms of modern software development and some of the things that we see as vulnerabilities that are known to be part of, can be traced back to poor design choices, right? So again, I commend CISA, and I think, it's one of those things that if we're going to continue to be powered by software, we have to have a way to do a deep dive into the design, right? Whether that's, having the right authentication, right, trust boundaries, the right use of encryption, how we protect sensitive data, how we do privileged access. All these things are design principles that we need to design in, right? It becomes a security mindset where everyone as part of the team need to think about security differently and how adversaries can potentially abuse and misuse certain aspects of the design to achieve their, compromise a system or exploit a certain vulnerability. So I do think secure by design is something that I'm very proud that CISA is doing, but I think, we need to have better understanding and knowledge, right, about what that means. And I think it has to go a little bit deeper than just no default passwords.
Yeah, so let me open a little bit of a can of worms on the topic of, so you kind of touching on software supply chain security at this point. So, we talk about secure by design and what vendors should do, what suppliers should do. They should do these things. They should design a system a certain way. But as you know, there's economic incentives at play, speed to market, revenue, investment, venture capital. Security is not necessarily a top priority in many cases because it's being driven by economic incentives, or developers are, graded based on performance and velocity of backlog burn down and things like that. So when you look at secure by design, like the guidance is, maybe great, right? But, how do you think we'll get to the next level of getting suppliers to prioritize these things, since, they're not necessarily incentivized to do so?
That's one of those long questions that I've thought about, even in my days back at S&T. Like, how do we incentivize people to do the things they should do, right? And I think, we have to make security easy or simple, right? We have to make security as part of culture, right? And I think one of the things is really, because so much software is driven by open source, we got to figure out a way, how do we do a better job in creating better quality software and security around open source software, because that's a large part of what we are doing to develop software. So major components, libraries, they become, key aspects of our design, our developers' design decisions. So figuring out a way how to improve the hygiene of software becomes very important. And I know that there's been talks here and there. I haven't seen anything like formalized about supporting open source community. Way back when I was, when I was at S&T around the Heartbleed vulnerability, folks from the Open SSL Foundation reached out, looking for ways to partner with S&T and really try to get additional funding and trying to figure out how do we, provide the necessary resources to kind of support the project, because it's heavily used not only in government but also private sector. So I do think that, having a healthy ecosystem around open source becomes a key priority, right? And figuring out how we, build the partnerships and collaborations to do that, I think is very important. I think that's one of the first things we have to do. And the other thing about incentivizing is, I think, understanding that, it goes to something I always say about software development lifecycle. I'm not sure we really know what key tasks and activities contribute to better quality and security in software. If there are 100 tasks, 100 activities, which of the 100 is known to produce or contribute to producing better quality and security software? I don't think we know, and I think that it would be a good research topic to look at. I formally reached out to some of my former PIs, primary investigators, who done research for me, and we were thinking about starting a commission to kind of look at this stuff, right? Because I do think there is a academic aspect to it, right? To try to understand the gaps in state of the art and the state of practice, so we can clear the runway so that we can innovate at a very faster pace, right? And one of the things that I've always said is like, Microsoft SDL has been around for years, but we still see a lot of vulnerabilities creeping up. So is it SDLC doesn't work, or it could be it doesn't work, or is it because accumulation of technical debt prevents the SDL from providing the intended benefits that we're looking for? I don't know, but I think that's a very interesting research topic, right? To kind of pull the threads on, to kind of figure out like what exactly or what contributes to better quality software. If we could do that, I think we can have a better way of figuring out like what is the trajectory in terms of how do we make leaps and bounds and improving software security. Because at this point, we can't ask suppliers to do something that we don't know will produce the intended results. And I think that's a lot of the drawback. It hasn't been verbalized that way, but I think that's a lot of pushback. Like, you want me to spend all this money on this SDLC, but I don't know if it's going to, produce the intended result. And then the other thing is software attestation, software liability. These things are now being talked about and tied to SDLC. Even the SSFDF are tied to SDLC, but we need to first understand whether or not an SDLC works, right? And if it does, what are the tasks and activities that we should do religiously? And if it's 10 of those things, we should do those things religiously. That's not to say the others don't work, but I do think there are some activities probably are known to produce or contribute, I should say, to producing better quality in software. And we need to know what those things are and harmonize those things and codify those things into operational environments and development environments.
Yeah, I think that's super well said. And you talked about SSDF, which is something I thought about. We're seeing a push, obviously, for the federal government trying to require suppliers to attest to, align with SSDF. But you're kind of speaking the language of threat-informed defense, which is something I know you're passionate about. Like SSDF is one example, but there's obviously NIST 853 and FedRAMP and RMF and all these things, all these control baselines. But you're saying like we don't really truly know these practices and controls. We don't know exactly which ones have the biggest impact or biggest mitigation in terms of risk, right? So you're saying there's an opportunity for the academic community to dig into there and see like of these SSDF practices, these secure software development lifecycle practices, which ones are actually going to have the biggest impact and which ones should be prioritized the most or be a concern for consumers the most of a supplier not following certain practices. So you've talked a lot about that threat-informed defense. What do you think we do wrong when it comes to compliance? When you look at things like FedRAMP and NIST and RMF and SSDF, we don't seem to have that threat-informed defense type approach. We just have this blanket approach of, here's 300 controls, here's 250 controls, whatever, go do all the things. How can we get a little better of kind of prioritizing?
Well, we know security doesn't mean compliance, right? And compliance doesn't mean security. So I think there's a balance, right? We have to strike the right balance. But for me, back when I was at MITRE, I was like, listen, one of the things I know for certain is that if you look at all the attacks that have happened, if you look at a lot of, the major attacks, typically no one ever sees the day to leave, right? so I've always thought that there's a subset of attacks there are a subset of security controls that are prevalent across all attacks, right? And figure out how do we visualize and represent what those controls are, because to me those are the things that we should focus on. We need to elevate cyber defense by focusing on those. So one of the things I did when I was at MITRE, I supported the CDM project, and I was like, hey, we're using 853 to do cross-reference with controls to kind of look at technologies and capabilities. I said one thing we're not doing is understanding and bringing a threat-informed defense approach to this, right? And understanding here's the touch point across many of the attacks, and here are the controls overlays that can be potentially, if they were in place, mitigate threat active behaviors, right? So today, which I'm very proud of, right? I supported the Center for Threat Informed Defense project where we looked at 853. I was one of the first initial ones who wrote a paper that kind of eventually led to that research project, where we looked at 853 controls and mapped into MITRE attack. And what that does, it helps help organizations understand how to plan for, implement, design security controls that are known to prevent and mitigate threat actor behavior. So now fast forward to, this is around 2017, fast forward to around 2020, 2021. Now you have MITRE defend, which is countermeasures to attack, right? So now, we have a way to represent defense and offense and really have a good relationship to really see how we can express, how threats can be expressed, right, within an operational environment, but also how we can implement controls or countermeasures to mitigate that. And one of the things Defend does, it does map back to 853. So having a way to harmonize that, I think, becomes very important, because now we're talking 800 controls eventually we got to look at, right? Not all controls are created equally. So taking a threat-informed defense, to me, is a way to kind of provide that level of understanding in terms of, like, here are the controls we need to prioritize. They are non-negotiable. Here are the things we need to do. And the other thing, which I don't see, is the need to kind of, how do we emulate threat actor behaviors as part of a way to validate controls, right? And using red teaming, threat adversary emulation, to kind of test and assess gaps in cyber defense, right? We have to have a way, and it has to be written into these frameworks to kind of encourage agencies, encourage community to start doing some of these activities. I know some organizations do it, but by and large, it should be a standard practice for any federal system, for any system that is being ran within a federal government, whether it's FedRAMP or whatever the case may be. Because to continuous monitor, we have to continuously monitor and test these controls on an ongoing basis, because threat actor capabilities evolve over a period of time. And we do know security controls become stale over a period of time. So in order to kind of prevent that, we have to figure out a way how we raise that level, raise that bar to a certain extent.
Yeah, you're speaking a real mature approach to cybersecurity and compliance and bridging the gap between the two, which is, taking our realistic approach that we have limited resources and limited staffing. We have to address the most critical controls that are tied to actual threat activity, right, and prioritize. And then you're also saying, like, don't just tell me you're doing a control or show me a paper that says you're doing something. Start to actually emulate adversarial activity and go and test and validate that these things are being done, not just once, but on a continuous basis. So that's a really mature approach to cybersecurity.
So the thing about it, if you're FedRAMP High and you get breached, right? What does that say, right? So I think having a way to constantly do some form of a deeper dive around continuous monitoring becomes very important. I think threat adversary emulation is a way to kind of help bridge that gap and provide better visibility around gaps in our cyber defense, around known threat actor behaviors.
Yeah, I'm on board with that. I think that the way we do ConMon in terms of compliance right now is kind of, we take a subset of the controls, maybe 33% of them, we test them once a year, we call it a day, and then we revisit, that subset of controls when we do a reauthorization in 3 years. Like, that's not the pace of the threat. That's not the pace of the adversary. It's just not efficient or effective. One thing I want to dive into too is, like, we've seen a lot of buzz lately, obviously, around generative AI, ML, and the perils and risks of AI, but you've been talking about the opportunities of AI and ML for cybersecurity for the defensive purposes. Some of the promise of these technologies from cyber defender perspective. Going back, I think it was like 3-4 years, I found dialogue you've been putting out there on these topics. What are your thoughts around not only the risk of AI, but the promise of it, of what we can do to actually be more defensive, more resilient with these technologies?
I want to give a big shout out to one of my colleagues, industry colleagues, Mike Walker, who ran the CGC Cyber Grand Challenge at DARPA. Where they were probably one of the first that I saw use AI machine learning in a way to look for, automate the discovery of vulnerabilities and do automated fixes through that Cyber Grand Challenge. So I think, that provided a path for it, right? And I can remember calling Mike up. This is when I was still at S&T. I called Mike up and said, "Hey, Mike, let's do lunch." And we talked about, things, because what I wanted to do, I wanted to take the work he did and kind of create a new start, right, around it. And I had a new start right before they cut the budget within the cybersecurity division. I had a new start lined up, ready to go, that kind of was going to be the next iteration of some of the things that he learned and was able to accomplish from the Cyber Grand Challenge. One of the things we agreed to, one of the supercomputers, or I'm gonna call it a supercomputer that we use in the Cyber Grand Challenge, we were going to ship it to Madison, Wisconsin for Swamp, the software assurance marketplace, and leverage that in the software assurance marketplace as a way to kind of do the transition and kind of evolve some of the things he did and use AI ML to kind of understand, how do we do vulnerability discovery? How do we look for creative ways to do patch automation? Because now, if we can extrapolate that information, now we can then figure out how do we look for ways to improve static analysis or software assurance tools that are supposed to detect these type of bugs. So I kind of wanted to use that as a way to kind of have my new start moving in that direction. But in terms of artificial intelligence, and I think it provides a lot of promise, right? But we have to be, very cognizant of the fact that, threat actors are using it too to accelerate attack vectors, right? How they do phishing and automated attacks. So we're still trying to keep pace with what threat actors are doing. But I like AI and ML in the context of really trying to, what I call, do responsive cyber defense and understand how do we use early warning capabilities, leveraging AI ML to look for signals of threat actor behaviors early on in the attack lifecycle, which will allow us to do proactive threat hunting and hunt down versus the hunting up, right? Typically, we're hunting up with IOCs. IOCs are too late in the attack lifecycle. We have to do early warning stuff around pre-attack, right? So we know there's a lot of AI ML used in pre-attack to do reconnaissance, resource development, things of that nature. How can we get signals and leverage that early on to kind of prevent the initial access? Once they get initial access, it's fair game at that particular point. So using AI ML to kind of do things like, improve our ability to do detection, right? Because what I think is a area for, and what we're doing at, I should say, what we're doing at OpenText, we have a technology called Intercept, which was a technology that was funded through InQtel. It was a part of the InQtel work project. So we acquired that maybe 4 or 5 years ago. We're leveraging that as our AI fabric across our portfolio to help us understand and use unsupervised machine learning to make sense of all the telemetry we collect around endpoints, network, and things of that nature. And the goal is to reason about things, right? To find those outliers because I will always say detection, 3 failed login attempts doesn't mean anything now in today's cyber world, right? You have to build the context across the entire stack to make sense of what's going on, to find, I call it the weirdness, the unknown threats that are lurking in your environment, that's lurking in your EDR telemetry, XDR telemetry. So how do you pinpoint and belly that up in a way that allow people to pivot to that and respond to that in a very effective way? So all the alerting that we get, the alert fatigue that we see that was so common with security operations centers, leveraging AI ML can be promising in that area, but I think it still need to be human driven, right? And we need to codify our intuition into those things. One last thing, a good buddy of mine, David Molnar, who was at Microsoft at the time, now he's at Meta. He did a presentation sometime around 2016. He said, "What can security do for AI?" And they were talking about codifying your intuitions. So intuitions are things that we know about building, breaking, fixing, hunting, and all these things that are a part of our intellectual phenomena. How can we codify that into machine learning models, right? Where we can pinpoint specific things that we need to find. And I think, like I said, human-driven AI and ML is the way we need to start approaching. And sometimes we have to color outside the box because threat actors are doing that. We can't continue to color inside the box. We have to be more creative in terms of how we use our imaginations to reason about ways in which threat actors can attack us.
Yeah, I think that's super well said. It's like you kind of laid out the point that AI needs to be a force multiplier, right? Driven by, human intelligence and intuition and things like that, but, used to enhance our capabilities to monitor the plethora of logs and activity that we're seeing, anomalous behavior. And I think that, it's super important that as security, as a community, we don't just sit back and admire all the risks and concerns around AI. We need to be using it, building that muscle memory, because you can rest assured, like you said, the adversaries are already out there testing it, tinkering it, seeing how they can use it to be more effective, more efficient. So we need to be doing the same thing on the defensive side as well.
But also we need to learn from AI, right? AI is constantly learning about our environment, but we need to take that feedback loop and learn back from AI to do that knowledge transfer, so that we can be somewhat more aware of things that could go wrong and will go wrong in the context of cyber. So I do think there's that feedback loop, and once we continue to mature AI, once we provide the overarching guidance, governance, just to say, for safe, secure AI and ML, I think we can trust what we can get back from these models to kind of do that knowledge transfer back into the human, so they can do their job at a more effective and more efficient way. So.
Yeah, well said. And folks that are looking for, some resources around that governance, just a couple of plugs that I've been coming across that are useful. I found the OWASP AI Exchange has some great resources on there, as well as NIST has an AI risk management framework that you can dig into and check out as well. And then I wanted to ask you as well, you made some comments recently, in the last several months about the public a cloud attack surface, basically the implications of that for national security. We see that, defense is, heavily invested in cloud. We saw the JEDI to JWCC saga. We see intelligence communities, all in on cloud, using cloud extensively, or hoping to, right, in many cases. What are your thoughts around the public cloud attack surface and the implications around that for national security that you've talked about a little bit?
So what it seems to me, right, just from where I'm sitting, right, and this is Kevin's perspectives, right, I do think we have a large attack surface for public cloud identity. And I'm not going to call out any vendors per se, but I do think, to me, that should be a national security issue. Because if we're seeing tailored attacks or targeted attacks at an enlarged attack surface where there's mainly two main public cloud vendors in that space, I do think it poses some significant risks to national security. All right. So how do we kind of create diversity around identity is an important thing we should consider. And I've been trying to look for ways to kind of, figure out how do we address that, right? And look for more defensive depth in terms of how we approach identity in public cloud, because I do think that it can have a crippling effect to national security if we constantly continue to see the onslaughts of attack that are targeting public cloud identity. I do think we need to kind of look for ways to leverage hybrid cloud in a more synergistic way, where we can reduce the attack surface and kind of leverage things that we know are important to have in place. Everyone don't need to go to the cloud. Everyone don't need to go to the cloud. But if we are going to go to the cloud, I do think that we have to be aware of an emerging threat, right? We start talking about supply chain attack. If you're part of a multi-tenant attack, then how does that impact you and your mission, right, in your organization, right? So there are some things that are concerning on my part, right? And I think so it almost seems like once we figure out, like sometimes it seems like once we figure out something new comes, right? And I think innovation presents that the opportunity to advance the state of practice. And I do think those who care about this nation are taking the necessary steps to kind of look for ways to expand and provide more diversity across identity. And I think looking for ways to onboard more innovative technology as part of that FedRAMP process, right? So how do we clear up that backlog to get more innovative technology, so it gives people a wider choice or a more diverse choices of technologies that can be used in public cloud identity? So I do think that may be an opportunity for us to make some really, really good progress.
Yeah, you almost opened up a couple wormholes that we could have got stuck down in talking about identity, as well as like FedRAMP modernization. We recently saw the FedRAMP modernization memo, so folks give that a look. It talks about things like OSCAL, machine readable artifacts, modernized TRC tooling and automation. But that would be a whole nother conversation. So I want to ask you, we're coming to the end of the year, so I couldn't let you go without asking, as we look to 2024, predictions are tough, right? What do you think you could see happening in 2024, man? What are some of the big things you think think we should keep an eye out for?
Predictions are one of those things where I try to stay away from predictions. But a couple of things that I'm focused on and really trying to advocate here at OpenText is the need to kind of really double down on cyber defense, right? And create what I'm calling responsive cyber defense. And we have some really, really cool capabilities that we're planning to, kind of bring to market. And I do think early warning signals become very important. If you look at APT 29, I was reading a research from, I forgot who it was from, but it was talking about indications and warnings, how indications and warnings was a military concept, but now we see it in cyber, right? Where we're using early warning signals to model and emulate threat actor behaviors, right? We've seen this happen with APT 29, where US Cybercom was able to get early warning signals. They were able to get malware. They ran malware through different sandboxes. And obviously, the adversary is constantly monitoring the tools we use, like VirusTotal, right? To make sure people are not catching on to their signals. So instead of the attack happening on a certain day, it pushed it out 6 days, right? So when we start talking about disrupting threat actor capabilities, it's not that we're going to stop them, but we got to make it harder, right? So if we can use early warning signals to kind of elevate in our cyber defense, right, by doing things like red teaming and finding gaps in our cyber defense, and using AI and machine learning to kind of make it a little bit more efficient in terms of what we need to test, how we get better quality and fidelity of alerts. How do we improve the telemetry we're getting from different parts of the network and different devices and things of that nature? So for me, it's really about bringing AI into the fold, right, and use it more mainstream as a underpinning for what we do, and be intelligent in terms of how we get to market with our solutions, because I do think people are asked to do more with less, and figuring out how do we harmonize and how do we kind of achieve economy of scales, because people need help, right? They need to kind of sort through and pinpoint what's going on. Like, how do I pivot to what's important? So I do think that figuring out a way how to, leverage AI, ML in a way that is beneficial to us, but also beneficial to helping customers. And I think we've on our path to that. We have something called Aviator, which is a huge platform that we have around AI. OpenText has been doing AI for years around the information management, right? Helping make better business sense of your information. So I do think extending that and bringing in things like the intersect technology that we have is something that I'm very excited about in terms of what to expect. In terms of, what I expect in terms of predictions, I'm not going to say predictions, but I do think we're going to probably see more cyber attacks in public cloud identity. I just think, losing an MSA key can't be good, and not knowing the effects of what that may be down the road, right? So you look at things that happen, and you have to say to yourself, like, okay, this happened, but this is not in isolation. This is something else is coming after that, right? And I see a lot of different attacks where you can possibly say there are things that the adversaries are potentially setting up for later down the road. We will see. So hopefully we can do a better job at securing what we're doing in public cloud to create more cyber resiliency so we can protect this nation.
Well said, man. Well said. So, one question we ask every guest here before we let them go is, what does the term cyber resilience mean to you?
For me, it's the ability to anticipate, right? Threat actor behavior. So I talked about the early warning signals, right? How can we model threat actor behavior? And one of the things I will say is most people don't have a threat profile, right? A threat profile is probably the most fundamental things that most organizations and businesses should have in place. That threat profile helps drives actionable intelligence and security intelligence to help inform about things to anticipate, right? So anticipate is important. And then ability to adapt and evolve cyber capabilities, cyber defense over a period of time. So I think the ability to anticipate, the ability to adapt to threat actor behaviors, and evolve cyber defenses, whether we're using AI, ML to create high fidelity alerts where we can then use step-up authentication or provide conditional access, or we can take them through a recertification process to make sure they are who they are and have the right access to information that they need to have access to. Because at the end of the day, we have to protect data from leaving the environment. And we haven't been doing a good job at that, but I do think that for me, from a cyber resilience standpoint, I think it is those kind of three key elements: ability to adapt, ability to evolve, and ability to anticipate.
Yeah, you won't hear any pushback from me. I think that's a pretty solid answer. So, Kevin, thanks for joining us today, man. We ran through everything from your kind of cybersecurity journey, secure software development life cycle, software supply chain security, AI, ML. Talked about some of the public cloud attack surface. For folks that joined us, thank you for tuning in. Definitely give Kevin a follow on LinkedIn. He got a lot of great comments and engagement on there. With like his thoughts and based on his experiences throughout his career. That'll take us out for today. Hope everyone has a great day.
Well, I want to say happy holidays, everyone. Enjoy your family time and be present. Our leader in federal sales, Randy Wood, wanted us to be present. So I want to extend that same notion to everyone. Be present with family. Family is the most important thing during this season. Happy holidays.
Sounds good. Take care, everyone.
Yeah.